I am Bryce Newberger, and this is the Kinship Chronicles, Children of the Phoenix, Chapter 2. A bright moon shone through the dark trees. Smythe cursed his luck. No sooner had the sun set than the moon was already waiting to shine bright. He had started his scouting mission right before twilight and sunset, which was actually the perfect time to sneak about. The sun is in everyone's eyes, confusing the senses. And if one is caught hurrying about, it is assumed that he's trying to finish some work before dark, or trying not to be too late for dinner. Though this time he was working longer than he expected. Smythe liked to think of himself as a scout, though in reality he was just the town gossip turned hireling for Mayor Gowan. The mayor would pay for any useful information he could scratch up. This paid for Smythe's alcohol tab at the tavern, which is where Smythe practically lived. Though the current piece of interest he was tracking down seemed like pure gold to him, he imagined it would at least pay for a month of booze. He bent low and stuck his fingers into an impression in the ground. The dirt was a little damp here, and it had left the faintest of boot prints. No rain or nearby water source could have left the wetness here. Smythe rationalized it must have been spilt from a canteen. He was deep into the forest surrounding the town of Ridgewood, so named for the fact that it sat on the edge of the forest that served as the border between the kingdom of Eterna and the surrounding kingdoms. Over the recent years, the neighboring kingdoms had begun to assimilate into the Third Empire, so named for the fact that it was the third human empire in the history of humanity, though the Emperor Rysval liked to name his empire the Rise Reach. Smythe searched about for more clues in the dim moonlight. He knew he was tracking a group of men, but how many? The boot prints he had found all left the same tread, which meant that either these men had all visited the same unimaginative cobbler, or their boots were uniform. He had only ran across maybe 5 or 6 water-endowed boot prints, but to find even one was extremely rare luck for a tracker, which means either these uniformed men were extremely clumsy, or there were so many of them that this was only a reflection of a small percentage that had spilt their water. He wasn't sure which he preferred. The information about a large group of uniformed men stomping about the forest would be handsomely rewarded, but would also be terrible news as well. He decided he had learned enough from sneaking about. It was time to lay eyes on this group. He stealthily but quickly sprinted through the forest, staying at least 5 paces from the path. Being stealthy had come easy for him. When he was young, he had run away from the orphanage that he hated, and since then he was forced to the life of a thief to survive. This was a classic tale for his day and age. He harbored no self-pity, or so he told himself. He had lost friends to plague and prison and betrayed some others. Now, as a consultant to the mayor, he considered himself to have turned a new leaf. Though his life was much the same, except he exchanged hiding from the guards for hiding inside a bottle to drown away what he had done in his life. He had a hole in his life that no amount of money, adventure, woman, or drink could fill. He thought maybe this payday could fix all that. He'd stuff a whole list of debauchery into that hole. He figured that should fill it. As he dreamt of the grandeur, he was shaken back to the focus of the sound of light bootfalls and a faint voice trying to bark hushed orders. Smythe let out another curse. Soldiers, he thought. He lowered into a crawl and slid on his belly like a snake. When he peered through the bushes, what he saw there made him backtrack as quickly and stealthily as possible and run back to town like his life depended upon it. And he was quite certain it did. Smythe tore down the forest path, abandoning stealth. He wanted to make it to town as quickly as possible, and he figured that everyone he should fear was behind him. The moon was in full view overhead, and he was about 5 kilometers outside town. He had been working for the mayor for about 7 years now and hadn't much reason to run in that time. Maybe a short sprint to avoid detection, but certainly not 5 kilometers. His heartbeat began to intensify. His lungs burned as his dry breath raked against his throat in the stiff, cold night air. A twig snapped ahead of him in the distance. He passed the area, then strained to look behind, checking for followers. He turned his gaze forward and caught a brief glimpse of metal before his vision blackened. A hard fall knocked the wind from him. A warm sensation filled his mouth. His eyes opened to a steel gauntlet clutching him by the throat. Backlit by moonlight, his attacker was hard to make out, especially through all the spots that seemed to be multiplying in his vision. "What shall we do with this one?" a smooth voice asked. General Fallhurst said no witnesses. Kill 'em, replied another gruff voice. Sorry, pal, spoke the man clutching Smythe. There was a glint of light reflecting off the man's blade as he raised it to throat level. Smythe squeezed his eyes shut and began to cry. His legs buckled, but the firm grasp held him up. Suddenly, he heard an explosion. He was thrown to the ground. From the dirt, he looked up to see an orange, ambient light filling the area. He realized the trees were on fire. The man who was holding him lay beside him, armless and lifeless. There was a vision of darkness in the inferno. His sight was blurred, but he could make out that it was a being in a long, dark coat. The other assailant in armor rushed him. There was the quickest exchange. An armor-clad man dropped to his knees and keeled over. Smythe heard a hushed breath blowing, and immediately the fire vanished, as if it were switched off. His senses screamed for him to jump up and run faster than he had ever run before, but all he could do was lay there, motionless, as if playing dead. The dark figure seemed even darker now that the fire had gone. He was approaching, or so Smythe thought. The man seemed to be the mere suggestion of a shadow. Darkness was given form as the stranger stooped down and a gloved hand came into view. Smythe was transfixed on one peculiarity about it. The glove looked like plain black leather in make, save for the tip of the middle finger and the thumb, which were covered in metal. The middle finger tip had a rough scored surface, while the thumb held a sort of stone in its center. Before he could ponder the subject further, he was hoisted up onto his feet. Now, standing face to face with his savior, he peered into the hood of the cloaked presence, but nothing was staring back. Shadow seemed to cling to the figure like a garment. While he should be thankful to the specter, he was only terrified. His legs found him again, and his wits shrieked for him to flee. He obeyed and took off down the road once more. The shadowy figure watched Smythe retreat. You're welcome. Thank you for listening. I'm Bryce Newberger, and this has been the Kinship Chronicles, Children of the Phoenix. If you enjoyed what you heard and you'd like to purchase the full book, then either look up New Books on the Google Play bookstore, NEU Books, or simply click the link in the description. The book is only $5, and I appreciate your support.